compile time, so when we actually write our program. In real programs, it's much more common that such values are actually dynamic, and we don't yet know these during development. So what actually if we want the user to input a certain number, and then we want to check whether that input is actually an even number? Because that way, we don't yet know whether the number the user will input when the program runs is actually even or odd. And that works in Kotlin via readLn. So we want to read a line in the console. And this returns a string. So this is the data type this function will return. We will get to functions and return types later on in this course. But for now, we can really just use this function and say val input is equal to whatever the user has entered. We can also give some instructions like println, please enter a number. Then we wait for the user to input a number. And then we could say something like, you've entered input. If we run this, then it says, please enter a number. And now it will wait for us to really enter something here. And once we did, it will assign the value of what we entered to this input variable. If we now enter a number, like 50, for example, and hit enter, then it will say, you've entered 50. So that's not fully dynamic. However, you will notice that if we now want to check whether that entered number is actually even or odd, we could of course say, is even input modulo 2 is equal to 0. But you can see we get an error. Why is that if we hover over it? Well, okay, that's maybe not too easy to understand if you're new to Kotlin or programming. But in the end, what this means is it couldn't find a corresponding internal function that calculates this modulo expression for this type of input. Because input, if we take a look here, is a string. And a string could be anything. A string could be hello world text. So how do you take a modulo from a hello world text? That doesn't work. There is no real logic behind that. So what we need is we need to tell our program, hey, please take this input and interpret it as a number. So we have it as an integer type. So we could say dot toInt, or we could also say val input as integer. That's maybe a bit more readable. And we say input dot toInteger. So we say toInt. And then we can take this input as integer, which is now of type integer. So it's a whole number. And we use that for the calculation. And we then take is even and say, is the number even? And we add our Boolean. Let's run this again. Please enter a number. We enter 45, hit enter, and it says, is the number even? No, it's not. If we run this again and we enter an even number, then it will tell us, yeah, that's even. However, what actually happens if we rerun this once more and we don't enter a number? We enter something like hello world, as I said. We just read in a string. This input here is just of type string, and a string could be anything. It could be any sequence of characters. So hello world would be a perfectly valid input here. If we hit enter, then we at least get a very big red text here. And it says exception in thread main, whatever that means, number format exception for input string hello world. So you can maybe kind of guess what that means. It failed to actually format the number because hello world is not a number. So what we say is, we have our string input and we interpret that as an integer, but that obviously only works if it is an integer. And if it's not an integer, something needs to happen there. Like we need to tell our code, okay, this is what you should do if the user enters an invalid value. And if we don't specify that, then there needs to be some kind of default behavior. And well, that is crashing the program, because if we don't define this behavior, then the program has no idea how to proceed. Because it's like, okay, what kind of value should I assign to this input as integer if this is actually not a valid number? That's something we need to define or tolerate our program to crash.